A Game of Solitaire, written by C. Scott Marcano. Chapter 3, Viking Blood. I never met my Danish grandfather, Erik, at least not in person. I heard his voice once on a tape recording when I was 9 years old. The cassette had been included in a large package that had arrived at our house out of the blue from the Canary Islands. It had been sent by my grandparents. Besides the tape, they had sent a long letter written to my mother, photos, gifts from Spain, and a set of her favorite childhood books that they had saved. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was the first contact between my mother and her parents in almost 15 years. The package arrived a few years after my mother wrote them a letter explaining that she had divorced my father and remarried my stepfather, Doc. We were living in Malibu then, in a small but quaint modern-style home on the hillsides above Zuma Beach. Growing up, my grandparents on both sides of the family were almost a complete mystery to me. I knew they existed, but I never thought of them much since my father and mother rarely spoke of their families. It was never explained what had happened, but it was clear there had been major problems on both sides due to my parents being an interracial couple. Because my mother was more talkative and outgoing than my father, I knew a little more about my Danish roots. I knew her parents had left Denmark and immigrated to the Canary Islands. My grandfather, Erik, suffered from emphysema, and the doctors thought the warmer climate would be good for his failing lungs. He had other injuries to deal with as well, from the war. My grandfather fought heroically in the Second World War. During the German occupation of Denmark, he'd left his wife and daughter to go underground and fight in the resistance movement. He gave up everything and risked his life to hide Jews from the Nazis. It wasn't just men like my grandfather, by the way. It was the entire country. The Danish people's heroism is a remarkable story that deserves so many more words than I can devote to here. Denmark, if you're not aware, is the only country occupied by Adolf Hitler that managed to save almost their entire Jewish population. The thought of my grandfather's and the Danes' heroic actions always gave me great pride growing up. Viking blood flowed through my veins. Hello there, Desmond, the gravelly voice on the tape began. This is Erik, your grandfather. My grandfather's English was excellent, but like my mother's, he had a slight slur when he spoke. When I got a little older, my mother explained it wasn't a speech impediment. Your grandfather's jaw was shattered when he was captured by the Germans, she said one night when she was in a reflective mood. They caught his group near an army base with explosives. The Gestapo killed his companions right away, but they kept my father alive. Why, I asked. Because they wanted him to talk. They demanded he give up the names of others in the resistance. She paused and took a long drag of her cigarette, but he wouldn't talk, so they tortured him. Brutally. It left deep scars on his body and his mind. By sheer luck, he escaped when a friend in the resistance forged transfer papers and snuck him out of a police station where they were holding him. They were going to shoot him in the morning. I very much want to meet you one day, my grandfather said on the tape. He went on to recount an amusing and inspiring story about my mother. He told how when she was a teenager, she had been an excellent athlete and loved to run races. She thought she was Pippi Longstocking, the strongest, fastest girl in the world, he said, chuckling. Well, in those days, young girls had few opportunities to race. The biggest track meets were reserved only for boys. But your mother, as you might know by now, is very stubborn. She set her mind on competing in the biggest track meet for teenagers in Copenhagen. I warned her not to do anything stupid, but she was just supposed to be in the stands with us, cheering for her school. But wouldn't you know it, she snuck onto the track with the help of her friends. Your grandmother and I were in our seats, looking around, wondering where she went. Then suddenly, I look down, and I see your mom lining up with the boys to race the 400 meters. Everyone could see she was a girl by now, and the whole crowd started pointing and laughing. I was so embarrassed I thought I would die. I shouted down at her to get off the track, but she ignored me. Before anyone could stop her, the starter's gun went off and your mother started running like hell. She was like a cheetah. Soon she was ahead of all the boys. Once she had the lead, the whole stadium started cheering for her. We did too. Your mother crossed the line first. She whipped all those damn boys. The entire crowd rose to their feet applauding her. I was so proud of her that I had tears in my eyes. As the story finished on the tape, I looked over at my mother. She had tears in her eyes too. A few days later, my mother asked me to make a tape of my own. She wanted to send it to her parents. I really didn't know what to say, but I gave it a try anyway, recording a little monologue on my cheap Panasonic tape recorder, talking about school and my hobbies. It was the second week after the box came that I returned from school to find my mother on the phone, sobbing. Not knowing what to do, I ran upstairs to my room. I knew bad news was coming. After a while, my mother knocked softly on my door and poked her head in. Her stunning blue eyes were red and puffy from crying. Her hands were trembling. "Your grandfather had a heart attack last night. He's gone," she said. I got up from my bed and went over to her. She folded me up in her warm embrace and held me there, clutching me desperately like I was a life preserver. I could feel her soul aching with each tear that fell, but I didn't cry. I felt terrible for my mom, but the loss was distant to me, abstract. Yes, I lost my grandfather, but it was hard to mourn a man I had never really known. My grandmother, Inga, came to live with us shortly after that. I didn't really know what to make of her at first because her behavior was so enigmatic. She was talkative and lively when dealing with my mother and my stepfather, Doc, but she was totally aloof and cold when interacting with my brother and me. Her English was bad, so that was part of the problem, but the issue ran much deeper than a simple language barrier. I could tell from her whole demeanor that Granny wanted to keep her distance from us. She never came to any of our school events, for example, or had any interest in watching us play sports. She never asked about my grades or even bothered to inquire how my day went. When my mom wasn't around, Granny spent most of her time holed up in her little house that we had built for her next to ours, alone. Trying to warm things up a little, I asked Granny to teach me Danish so I could speak to her better. But she made a face and said, "It's a waste of time. Danish? Too difficult for you to learn, I think." Funny enough, there was a kid in our neighborhood named David Wittenberg who was friends with my brother. He had some distant Scandinavian relatives and spoke a touch of Danish. When my brother introduced him, my grandmother immediately bonded with David in a way she never had with us. She extended an open invitation for him to come over for Danish lessons whenever he liked. David took her up on the offer, and for a time he would regularly come over to her place after school to hang out and chat in Danish. Later, David would run into me in the halls of Malibu Park Junior High, and he'd rave about how sweet and outgoing my grandmother was. I remember feeling confused. I had no idea who he was talking about. I'd never met that person. When I'd asked my mother why Granny was so standoffish with us, she'd just shrug and say, "Don't take it personal. We're Danes, Des. Granny's not trying to be mean. It's just that she and I have a special connection. You're not part of our culture. You wouldn't understand." I have to admit, it stung whenever my mother said things like that. It reinforced the perception in my mind that even within the confines of my own family, I was an outsider. Even though I had Viking blood in my veins, I began to realize I would never truly be a Dane. Still, I remained curious about my Scandinavian heritage. My mother encouraged my interest by reading me stories by Hans Christian Andersen. When I got older, she gave me books on Danish history and culture. We also made regular pilgrimage to Solvang, the quaint Danish tourist town near San Luis Obispo. I always look forward to these little road trips. We'd eat breakfast or lunch at Pea Soup Anderson's and then buy Danish candies in the gift shop. Afterwards, my mom and Granny would go shopping in Solvang, hobnobbing in their native tongue with all the expat Danish shopkeepers. The next day, we'd continue north to take a tour of Hearst Castle, but my mother would always make a point of stopping off in Cambria, where there was a quaint store run by an old Danish man called the Tin Soldier Factory. He made exquisite little figurines of military soldiers and fantasy characters that I collected and spent hours trying to paint correctly. By the time I was in the 8th grade, David Wittenberg had lost interest in learning Danish and stopped coming around. It was around that time that Granny finally started to warm up to me a little. I began to realize how lonely she was. She spent most of her time sitting around her little house, bored, playing solitaire and watching soap operas while she waited for my mom to come home from work. I decided to reach out to Granny by coming over to watch General Hospital with her. Usually we'd play cards to pass the time while the show ran. Granny liked to play solitaire using 3 decks to make the game more of a challenge. We'd take turns, working as a team to beat the deck. Sometimes we'd have a conversation, conjecturing about the latest scandal involving Luke and Laura, but usually we just hung out together without saying much at all. Granny never admitted it to me, but I know, despite her icy silence, that she appreciated the company. Although my mother encouraged my interest in learning about my Danish roots, she never wanted to talk about her own life in Denmark, especially her childhood during the German occupation. Even though she tried hard to avoid it, things would bubble up to the surface sometimes. Something would trigger her, and then awful memories would tumble into her mind and overwhelm her. I remember once, when I was 9, we were watching Hogan's Heroes on TV. One minute she was laughing at all the cheesy jokes, then suddenly a dark cloud passed over her. She got very serious. Tears welled up in her eyes. "What's the matter, Mom?" I asked. The bombs just wouldn't stop," she gasped. "I saw them all lying there, their little bodies torn to shreds. Those poor babies." I had no idea what she was talking about. When Mom finally calmed down, she told me the horrifying story about how Allied bombers flying over Denmark to attack factories in Nazi Germany had accidentally released their bombs too soon over Copenhagen. Several of the bombs had landed on her school, killing dozens of her preschool classmates. Sitting there on the couch that day, trembling like a leaf, she was reliving the whole gruesome scene again. Just like her father, the war had left a scar that would never fully heal. For that reason, my mother always hated guns and war movies. She would tolerate us playing with G.I. Joes and painting tin soldiers, but she refused to ever buy us toy guns to play with, even squirt guns. "Real war isn't a game," she'd often say to me. What would Mom think of me now, I wondered? After all her valiant attempts to steer me away from ever wanting to own a firearm, here I was, driving down to see my grandmother with a loaded .38 stashed in my glove compartment. It was a few days after Big D had given me the gat. My grandmother had asked me to come down to Escondido to help her submit her application to the local Medicare office. Granny was eligible to receive Medicare because she had a green card and had low enough income to meet the threshold to qualify, a contention that was obviously called into question by the fact that she had owned an expensive home the previous year. "You're just making assumptions," my older brother Derek insisted when I expressed the same concerns to him on the phone a few days ago. "We don't know jack shit. There's no proof she even sold the house for a profit. The bank could have foreclosed on it for all we know." "Maybe," I said. "Should I ask her about it?" "And say what? That you've been secretly spying on her behind her back? How's that going to play out, bro? She'll just get pissed off and never trust us again. Even if she was up to something, it's not like she's going to tell you anything anyway. It's pointless." "But what if Chip's still creeping around? Have you seen him? Have you even found an address where he's staying in San Diego?" "No," I admitted. "Then it's probably just like Granny told you. He went back to Alabama. Look, we could drive ourselves crazy, speculating about one thing after another, but at the end of the day, it's all just smoke and no substance. We need to stick to the principle of Occam's razor. You heard of that, right?" I had. When trying to solve a mystery, the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Not usually, always. There's no conspiracy, bro. Chip isn't hiding in the bushes waiting to jump you. Come on, that's just ridiculous. The truth is simple. Granny burned through the money Mom left her. Now she needs our help because she can't afford health insurance. And you know what? In spite of everything, we do have an obligation to take care of her. Whatever happened, she's family. Know what I'm saying? We need to step up and do the right thing here. I guess. The thing is, this is really hard for me emotionally, especially alone. Maybe you should come with me the next time I go down there." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'd be there in a heartbeat, bro. You know that, right? Unfortunately, it's just insane at my company right now. They need me here 24/7. But whenever you want to talk things out, just give me a holler. I got your back. Look, I know this is tough for you, but stay strong. You're doing such an awesome job. Mom would be so proud of you. I love you, bro." "Thanks. I love you too," I said unenthusiastically. We ended the call after that. After I hung up, I realized there was no point in talking further to Derek about my concerns. I especially couldn't tell him about the gun or what Big D had said to me. It would only serve to rile him up and spur him to question my judgment even more. My brother had made up his mind. There was no convincing him otherwise, unless I had better evidence. Still, I had to wonder, if Derek was so sure nothing was going on, why didn't he want to come with me? "Hello, darling," my grandmother said in a cheery voice as she greeted me at the door of her small apartment. "Hi, Granny," I replied. As I stood there in the entryway, I noticed an elderly man sitting quietly in a chair in her living room with a wry grin on his face. I'd never seen him before, but I instantly guessed who he was. Des, this is Sven, my grandmother said. My boyfriend. Sven put a book down that he was reading and got up from his chair. He walked briskly across the small room and greeted me with a hearty, firm handshake. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Desmond, he said in a gentle voice. Your grandma has told me so many wonderful things about you. It's nice to meet you too, I replied. He made a gesture for me to enter, as if this was his own apartment. Please, come in. He had a notable Danish accent, but I could tell his English was much better than my grandmother's. I pegged his age being in his late 60s, which made him at least 20 years younger than my grandmother. He was a handsome man for his age, with few wrinkles on his sharp features. He had a full head of still blondish hair that was cut short and kept neat. Although he instantly gave off an air of being affable and easygoing, his penetrating blue eyes were studying me carefully. Given the obvious age gap between them, I surmised that the premise of him being Granny's boyfriend was probably a lie. They ushered me over to the small dining room. My grandmother had prepared one of my favorite dishes, a Danish stew she and my mother used to make from scratch with beef, potatoes, cabbage, and carrots. The taste of the Danish stew immediately brought back a flood of happy memories. Granny saw the look of satisfaction on my face and smiled. It's been a while, eh? It's delicious, as always, Granny. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. As we ate, my grandmother and Sven gave me a brief rundown about how they met at a local Lutheran church that was attended by a small group of Danish expats living in San Diego. They told me they'd started dating shortly afterwards. I didn't press them on the veracity of their story, although the dating part did seem a bit far-fetched. So, you're in the film business? Sven asked, switching gears. Yes, I said as I dipped a sourdough roll into my stew. How's that going for you? I paused briefly as I chewed my bread, thinking to myself, should I tell them the truth? It's going okay, I replied. Eager to avoid having to explain further, I asked Sven, what do you do for a living? Oh, little old me, he said with a grin and a twinkle in his eye. I just retired from the import-export business. You have family back in Denmark? Yes, of course. My dear wife Gretchen sadly passed away many years ago from cancer, but my son Gunnar still lives in Copenhagen with his wife Greta and my 3 grandchildren. He's in the import-export business as well. Sven then got up from the table and went into the kitchen. He returned holding a small container of imported, dehydrated onions. He's an executive for Jurgensen Farms, the company that makes these, he said, sliding the can across the table to me. I glanced at the familiar label. I recognized the popular Danish brand from my many trips to Solvang. Try some, they're very good. I know, I've had them before, I said as I opened the can and took a pinch of dried onions. Gunnar's doing very well with Jurgensen. They just promoted him to Vice President of Business Affairs. Would you like to see his picture? Sure, I replied. Sven reached into his pocket and took out his wallet. He removed a small color photograph from the billfold and handed it to me. In the photo was a happy couple with 3 cute kids standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. What an adorable family, I observed. Thank you, Sven said proudly. As Sven put the picture away, I started to feel guilty about all the suspicions that had been floating around in my head lately. Everything about Sven seemed to be totally on the level. He appeared to be nothing more than a good-natured widower who had befriended Granny. My brother's words about Occam's razor flashed through my mind. Maybe things really were that simple. After lunch, we went through my grandmother's application for Medicare. She had all her financial records organized on a small desk in her living room. I studied them carefully, poring over her rent and utility bills, the pension checks she received from Eric's last employer, her bank account statements that showed she only had a small bit of savings. From what I could tell, she would easily qualify for Medicare. There was one curious thing that gave me pause, however. When we filled out the application form, I read the questions aloud to both of them. If my grandmother didn't understand something I said, Sven would go back and read the question again, then translate it into Danish for Granny. Sven was, in fact, fluent in English. It made me wonder, if Sven was perfectly capable of filling out the application with her, why did Granny ask for my help? You two go inside. I'll wait out here, Sven said as I stepped out of the back of his high-end Mercedes. Are you sure? I asked, a little puzzled as to why he insisted on driving us over here just to sit in his car in the parking lot. Sven chuckled. Go on. I'm quite over the thrill of watching the wheels of bureaucracy turn along. After waiting in several long lines and filling out even more forms, my grandmother and I were finally ushered into the drab cubicle of one Julie Sanchez, our Medicare caseworker. She was a young, friendly Latina in her early 30s. She had a master's degree in social work and sounded like she genuinely cared and wanted to help. I explained that my grandmother's English wasn't good, so I was helping her. "Great, I'll make you the point person then," Julie said. "Can I call you if there's any issues I need to go over?" I agreed, and she took down my number. After a long review of all the forms and documents, Julie finally nodded. "Well, everything seems to be in order. I'm going to send your grandmother's application through for final approval. I have to warn you, though, it may take a while for the review process to be completed. There's a pretty big backlog of cases right now. But don't worry, I'm going to give your grandmother a voucher so she can get treatment at a low-cost clinic in the interim." "What did she say? I don't understand," Granny said, looking worried. "Don't worry, Granny. I'll have Sven explain it to you later. Everything is fine." I gave her a reassuring smile, and she patted my arm. When Sven drove us back to the apartment, my grandmother invited me in to have a cup of coffee and play a game of solitaire before I made the long drive back to L.A. Sven left us alone as we played, preferring instead to sit quietly in a chair, reading a novel. Working together again, just like the old days, we managed to beat the deck. "Ha! We won!" she cried after I placed the last card in the row. We high-fived each other and shared a hearty laugh. As I got up to leave, Granny suddenly remembered something. "Wait, Des, I have something for you." She went to her bedroom and emerged a few moments later, carrying a large cardboard box. "I've been saving these things for you," she said, as she handed the cardboard box over to me. To my pleasant surprise, it was filled with various things from my childhood. A coffee mug with the face of a hobbit I made in ceramic class, old comic books, faded Kodak photos, a colorful poster my mother had bought me in Solvang of all the Danish kings, and my collection of little metal soldiers from the Tin Soldier Factory. All these things were very dear and sentimental to me, but there was one item that caught my particular attention, a funny-looking rectangular box with levers sticking out of it. The puzzle box. "Thank you, Granny," I said, almost getting choked up. "You're welcome, darling," she replied warmly. As I walked down the stairs, heading for the parking lot, Granny and Sven stood in the doorway of her apartment, holding hands, smiling ear to ear. "You must come back again soon," my grandmother called after me. "Yes, you must come and meet my nephew, Born," Sven added. "He lives with me. He's a wonderful young man and bright, just like you. You'll like him." "Sounds great," I replied. At that moment, I felt happy and hopeful again. I glanced over at a patch of decorative bushes near my car and shook my head, embarrassed by my seemingly out-of-control paranoia. Derek was right, I thought to myself. Chip wasn't hiding in the bushes. It was time to move on. The long drive back to L.A. gave me the perfect opportunity to take a long, hard look at the sorry state my life had fallen into since my mother's death. What the fuck had happened to me, I wondered. I used to be a happy-go-lucky guy. Now I was a paranoid wreck, a clumsy, wannabe detective who brought hidden guns to lunches with his grandmother. Christ, I said to myself, I really need to make some changes in my life. I decided that working at Billy Rose's PI firm wasn't good for me. Defending criminals from a rundown Skid Row office was clearly distorting my worldview. I needed to get back to writing movies. I resolved to call my good friend Jeff Crook and ask for help in the morning. Jeff was one of my closest friends from undergrad. He'd started his own successful entertainment company, Crooked Entertainment. Although Jeff had the cunning of a Mako shark, he wouldn't have gotten this far in Hollywood without killer instincts. His heart was usually in the right place. I knew that he'd been very worried about me lately. Surely Jeff would give me an entry-level job if I asked him. I needed to get rid of that gun, too, or at least put it somewhere out of sight and out of mind. When I got back to the apartment, I put Big D's gat in a shoebox, then stashed it on a high shelf in the back of my hall closet. I put the large cupboard box that Granny had given me up there, too. I didn't need to go through all these sentimental items right now. Better to look at them in a couple of months when they wouldn't trigger me emotionally. Before going to bed, I said a little prayer. God, make tomorrow a better day. Let the sun shine back in my life again. Let my poor mother's soul find peace in heaven. Help me to provide aid and comfort to my grandmother. Lead me out of darkness, Lord. Most of all, help me to see the truth. No matter how painful, please give me the strength and wisdom to accept it. Amen. Crash! Bang! As the jarring, loud sounds rang out, my eyes fluttered open and drifted over to the digital clock beside my bed. It was just past 3 a.m. Suddenly, I heard another loud crash coming from outside my room. It must be Rude Boy getting into some mischief, I thought. I groggily reached over to turn on the light on my nightstand, but my arm brushed up against something soft and furry. It was Rude Boy. He was sitting on the bed beside me. His eyes were wide open, big as saucers. He was staring at my bedroom door, making a low growl. Shit, it's a break-in. My mind exploded in panic. I slithered silently out of bed and crept up to the door. I held my breath and listened. Only silence answered me. I turned quickly and grabbed a big wooden softball bat I kept near my bed. "I just called the cops. I have a gun, asshole," I shouted out, hoping to scare the intruder away. But still, I heard only silence coming from the other side of the door. After waiting tensely for a minute or two, I decided to investigate. I turned the doorknob and slowly swung the door wide open. Light from my bedroom spilled into the dark hallway that connected my room with the rest of the apartment. I immediately saw that the hall closet door was ajar. A platoon of little tin soldiers was scattered about on the floor in front of it. I crept closer to get a better look. The cardboard box my grandmother had given me was lying on its side in the closet. I could see an overturned shoebox beside it. The .38 Beretta had tumbled out and was leaning against the half-open door. Raising my bat, ready to swing at anything that moved, I tiptoed from room to room, but no one was there, except for me and Rude Boy. The doors were all locked and the windows were latched tight. I breathed a big sigh of relief and returned to the mess in the closet. The big cardboard box must have fallen off the shelf and knocked the shoebox off too when it came down. Thankfully, I unloaded the gat so it didn't go off when it hit the floor. That's weird, I thought to myself. I was certain I'd put the box on the shelf securely so it wouldn't topple over. The apartment suddenly felt odd at that moment. It was hard to explain the feeling, but I had the distinct sensation that someone was watching me. Rude Boy felt it too. He was prancing about anxiously and kept staring into the closet apprehensively. I quickly dismissed the thought that a ghost was roaming around. That was silly, I told myself. Remember Occam's razor. The boxes had simply fallen over. That's all. Ignoring the eerie feeling in my gut, I started to clean up the mess. Amazingly, nothing had broken. I began putting the tin soldiers back inside the box when my eyes fell upon something that made me pause for a moment. The puzzle box. My mother had given it to me on my 14th birthday. It was a rectangular wooden casket, about a foot long, 8 inches deep, made of red elm. There were little gears and levers around the exterior. It had no lock. To open it, one had to figure out a specific combination of gear turns and pulls on the levers to break the secret code. My mother had hidden $50 inside of it. I had to solve the puzzle in order to get my birthday money. It had taken me a few days. Listening carefully for faint clicks whenever I turned a gear or worked a lever before I was finally able to crack the box open. To pay my mom back, I decided I'd have a little fun with her too. So I stashed some of her favorite jewelry inside and told her it was her turn now. My mother had always loved puzzles and riddles. In fact, I think she got the puzzle box as much for herself as me. It didn't take her long to solve it too. This started a little game between us, where we'd change the adjustable code, then hide things inside for the other person to find. "I miss you, Mom," I whispered softly to myself as I picked the box off the floor and spun the gears around to make sure nothing had been damaged when it crashed to the floor. I was greatly relieved that everything seemed to be in working order. But as I turned the puzzle box over in my hands, I heard something faintly rattling around inside. It sounded light, like paper. What could that be, I wondered? Had my mother hidden something inside years ago that I'd never gotten around to finding? Even though it was late, I couldn't help myself. I began manipulating the little gears and levers, then listening for the familiar faint clicks. I was a little rusty, so it took me a little bit before I was able to crack the code again. I opened the lid and peered inside. Lying on the bottom of the box was a small pile of neatly folded pages. My jaw dropped. It was a letter. I took it out of the cask and immediately recognized my mother's impeccable handwriting. The letter was addressed to me. There was a date near the top of the first page. It had been written by Mom just a few weeks before her death. I ran and got my glasses from the bedroom. Then I hustled over to the desk and began to read. Dear Des, I know this might seem a little strange, even childish, communicating with you like this, but I thought it was appropriate since this is how we used to send secret messages to each other. I wish I had the courage to say this to you in person, but I'm embarrassed to admit that I don't. Even after all these years, these memories are very painful for me. Also, I was worried that it would drive a wedge between us. I always wanted you to take pride in being half Dane. I was afraid you'd resent your heritage if I told you everything that happened. I've had a few glasses of wine tonight, so forgive me if I ramble on a bit. I felt like I had to do this now because, well, you get older. You start to wonder how much time you have left. Just in case anything happens to me, I wanted you to know the truth, at least part of it anyway. Since you were young, you've asked me a lot of questions about the Danish side of the family, but I've avoided talking about them. I know it's frustrated you. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. As I said, it was just too painful for me to talk about. Often you would ask me why your grandfather and I had such an intense falling out. I meant to tell you the real reason when you were old enough to understand it, when you got to college, but we started having so many conflicts then over race that I was worried it would just make things worse. The reason my parents and I stopped speaking to each other for so many years was because of your father. My parents didn't want me marrying him. The reason was because he was black. Your grandfather's racism was wrong. But I want you to understand he was a very complicated person. You shouldn't judge him solely by his faults. He did try to connect with you towards the end of his life. I think that counts for something. I know it's no excuse for what he did, but he was in constant pain, both physically and mentally, because of what the Nazis did to him. So much so that he actually became addicted to painkillers after the war. But it wasn't just the physical torment he suffered. The war cost him his most cherished dream. My father had always wanted to become a surgeon, but he had to drop out of medical school to serve in the resistance. During his interrogation, the Germans broke his hands. They didn't heal properly, and as a result, he was left partially maimed. Dad knew he could never be a surgeon after that. It was a very bitter pill for him to swallow. That's why he pushed me so hard in school. He wanted me to become a doctor and live out his dreams for him. As time went on, he became more and more obsessed with it, to the point that he took things too far when it came to pushing me in school. Sometimes he'd hit me if I didn't get straight A's. I know he did it out of love because he thought that he was doing the right thing. But looking back, I realized that it was abuse. I loved my parents, but by the time I was ready to go to college, I just couldn't be around my father anymore. His addiction to painkillers was taking over, and he became too controlling. I wanted to have my own life, so I left Denmark and went to England, then to medical school in Canada, where I met your father. Knowing your grandfather and his prejudices, there was no question that dating your father would be a problem, but I've always been a bit of a rebel, so I did it anyway. Soon we fell deeply in love and became engaged. I told my parents, and they were appalled. Your grandfather told me bluntly that he would never let me marry a nigger. It didn't matter to him that your father was going to be a doctor. He just couldn't accept him. A few months after I told them, I returned to Denmark for a short visit to try to sort things out with them and to collect my things. That's when the incident happened. My father tricked me into getting into his car, saying he wanted to go for a drive and talk. Once we started driving, however, he began swerving the car all over the road, threatening to crash and kill us both if I didn't agree to call off the marriage to that nigger doctor. I was just as stubborn and crazy as him, I guess, because I still refused. I thought the whole thing was just a bluff to scare me. Maybe it was, but because my father was driving so erratically, he lost control of his car and crashed into a tree. Fortunately, he hit the brakes before ramming into the trunk, so neither one of us were seriously hurt. At that point, I jumped out and ran back to our house, but your grandfather followed me. I tried to grab my things and leave, but Dad suddenly appeared, blocking the door. He had a hunting rifle he owned in his hands. He pointed it at me and said he would kill me if I left. "Go ahead," I shouted at him. He fired the gun. The shot would have killed me, but your grandmother grabbed the rifle barrel at the last moment. The shot went wide and blew a hole in the wall. After that, we just stood there in stunned silence. Then my father suddenly realized what he had done and felt deeply ashamed. He set the rifle down and collapsed into a chair. He buried his face in his hands and began to cry. I'd never seen him sob like that before. I didn't speak to my parents again for 15 years. There's more to this story and what happened during the war. A lot more. Much of it involves your grandmother, but I can't get into all that right now. Talking about these things, even after all these years, is very difficult for me. I'm sorry if telling the story upsets you. I didn't want you to hate your family. It was the 60s. Things were different back then, especially when it came to race. I don't condone what my father did, but I've learned to forgive him. Whether you do or not is up to you. I can't tell you how to feel. Maybe I should have kept this a secret, but I wanted you to know the truth. I love you. Mom. After reading the last line, I slowly put the letter down on my desk. I sat there for a long while, staring out the window, thinking. It felt like someone had just hit me in the gut with a sledgehammer. A flood of emotions washed over me. Sadness, anger, admiration, all started swirling up inside me at once. I knew that racism had something to do with my grandparents never being around when I was young, but I had no idea that it nearly cost my mother her life and negated mine. I felt seething outrage at my grandfather, proud of my mother, and indebted to my grandmother for intervening. I could barely process what I had just read, but I knew from that moment on I'd never be able to look at the Danish side of my family the same way ever again. I glanced over at the clock. It was 5 a.m. now. Through the window, I could see that the gloom of the night was just starting to lift. The sun was coming up. Soon it would be a brand new day. A few hours ago, I had asked God to show me the truth. Well, I guess my prayer had been answered, but not in the way I wanted or expected. I had been looking forward to turning over a new leaf on this new day. I was certain that things would be better once I set aside my amateur investigation into my mother's death. Soon, I had thought I'd forget about all the lies, secrets, and drama that had consumed me for the last 2 years. Now, after reading the secret revelation from my mother, I wasn't certain of anything anymore.